Well, now let's have a look at probably the most prestigious type of wine that is produced in France, the Champagne type of wine. Now, the wine growing region of Champagne is the northernmost wine growing region in France. And it produces great wine. Champagne has been said to be the wine of king and the king of wine. And there's a lot to be learned about Champagne. Well, when it comes to the grapes that produce Champagne, it is from the small region, and actually most of the Champagne, surprisingly enough, is produced from red grape. Actually, it's blended grapes. You've got some Pinot Noir, which is a red grape, and you get Chardonnay, which is a white grape. Now, it is very important that there should be no color imparted to the grape. So when it comes to the red grape, the grape is picked very carefully to make sure that it has not been squashed beforehand, so that there would be no color imparted to the juice. A process that is known as l'épluchage, and very tedious process, time consuming, and this is one of the reasons why Champagne is an expensive wine. Well, there is some champagnes that are produced from white grapes exclusively, and champagnes that are produced from white grapes are known as Blanc de Blanc. The area is known as Côte de Blanc. The history of Champagne, how it got developed, is interesting. The British actually were very fond of wines from this particular region. At that time, we're not talking about sparkling wine, regular wine. And what would happen is that in the fall, the wine would be shipped to England and it would be stored. But what would happen is that often the fermentation would not be completed. And what would happen is that in the spring, when the temperature would go up, some fermentation would start over again, and that actually would pop the cork of the bottle. And the British started to develop a liking for this sparkling wine, and they kept asking the French to send them more of that particular sparkling. And then we go back to the Champagne region, and as the story goes, French monk actually had the idea to carry out a secondary fermentation to produce carbon dioxide, which are the bubbles responsible for the bubbles in Champagne. And this monk had the idea in each bottle, once that primary fermentation is completed, to add a small amount of sugar and a small amount of yeast to produce a secondary fermentation in the bottle. That secondary fermentation producing the bubbles that we associated with Champagne. Now, the name of that monk responsible for this process, supposedly, is Dom Pérignon, and as you know, there is a great Champagne known as Dom Pérignon. Well, it's a good story, but unfortunately it's not true. Believe it or not, Champagne is not the result of a French discovery, but rather of a British one. Well before, a few decades before, Dom Pérignon worked on Champagne, on finding the best way to produce Champagne. An Englishman by the name of Christopher Meret had the idea of adding sugar and yeast to bottles of a bottle of wine to produce that secondary fermentation. So the French have to remember we owe our Champagne to the English. Well, actually, I came across some Champagne, or I shouldn't say Champagne, because the term Champagne is restricted to sparkling wine that is produced to this in the region of Champagne in France. So the term that should be used for other sparkling wine should be sparkling wine, or you can say that they have used la méthode champenoise, using this type of method, but actually it is Meret that introduced it, and this is a sparkling wine that is produced in England using the Meret method, so it's really not the méthode champenoise. So what happened is once that sugar and yeast is added to each individual bottle, the bottle is capsuled, the top is closed, and then it is stored. It is stored for 2 to 8 years. At that time, during that period of time, carbon dioxide is produced, a gas is produced, And as a result, you get a buildup of pressure. And because of that buildup of pressure, every so often, the bottle may actually explode. And I remember visiting the caves of Moët and Chandon in the Champagne region, and every so often you would hear, bang, hear another bottle exploding. The pressure inside each bottle is 6 to 7 atmosphere, meaning that it's 6 to 7 times greater than outside pressure, atmospheric pressure. And every year in Moët and Chandon alone, they lose 20,000 bottles due to this particular situation, due to explosion. 20,000 bottles, but actually in their caves, they have 100 million bottles. So it is a fair amount, but overall it's represents only a fraction of their total production. So in any case, after that secondary fermentation is completed, the bottles are placed on racks. The bottles are placed on racks with a neck down. And the reason for that is that secondary fermentation produces sediment. And of course, if you're going to spend $80 on a bottle of champagne, you don't want it to be cloudy. You don't want to be, you don't want to see sediment. So there is this technique that is used to remove the sediment. As I mentioned, the bottle is placed on racks, neck down, and every day someone would come and actually, the term that is used, riddle, move the bottles right and left. Quarter turn to the right, a quarter turn to the left, and this is to remove the sediment from the side of the bottle. So at the same time as you move to the right and to the left, you move up the bottle neck down, you move further down the neck so that the sediment, the sludge from the side of the bottle, actually will find its way into the neck. It's quite a delicate process, and it requires quite a bit of training to do it right. So at the end, that sediment that was found on the side of the bottle is present at the neck. And how to get rid of it? Well, that's a problem, because obviously if you're going to remove the capsule, if you're going to remove the cork, you're going to lose some of these combination. So a woman that owned a vineyard there, or a house producing champagne in the region, had the idea to found a way to deal with the problem. Her name was, she was a widow, her name was Clicquot Ponsardin, Veuve Clicquot Ponsardin. And she had the idea of placing the bottle in a cold brine solution to keep the bottle very cold, and under this condition to very quickly remove the capsule and then cork the bottle, a process known as le dégorgement. And today, actually, this is done. For expensive bottle, it's done manually. For other bottle, it is done by machine. At this time, just before that cork is placed, a small amount of sugar is added to the champagne. Interestingly, no yeast, of course, because you don't want secondary fermentation anymore. A small amount of sugar is added to every bottle. And depending on the type of champagne you're producing, you're going to add different amount of sugar. And that's from where the term comes from. Brut has very little sugar, less than 1%. Extra dry, actually the French use the English term, 2%. Sec, 6%. Demi-sec, 10%. Well, demi-sec is half dry, but it's 10% sugar, roughly the same amount of sugar you get in soft drinks. That's really not that interesting. Now, really interestingly enough, today there is a new classification or a new class that has come into being, and that is extra brut, which is 0.5%. Essentially, if you want to enjoy a good champagne, you want the least amount of sugar present, because the sugar actually will hide the taste, the real taste of the champagne. Now, one thing to mention is that normally champagne is a blended wine, blended not only in terms of the grapes, but in terms of the years. And when it is a good year, well, the point is that in terms of blended in terms of year, sometimes you have bad years, and what you do, you blend different years together to get something that is consistent. When you have a good year, then you declare a vintage. So that is of benefit. So actually, if you look at the label, you'll notice that some terminology, Blanc de Blanc, vintage, and brut. actually Blanc de Blanc tend to be more favored than the regular champagne. Blanc de Blanc is a champagne that has been made exclusively from white grape. A vintage is declared when there is an exceptional year. Otherwise, different years tend to be blended together to get something consistent. And for good champagne, you want a Brut. So if we look at this particular label, you notice it's a Blanc de Blanc. Therefore, it's made exclusively from white grapes, which is of benefit. A vintage has been declared, and this is also a Brut, indicating that it is a good wine. As I mentioned, today you'll find sometimes extra Brut, which for some people is better. You notice that this one also is a Blanc de Blanc, indicating that it is made from white grape. Sometimes you'll find champagne that are labeled as Blanc de Noir. Well, essentially what it says is that it is made from red grapes, it's made from red grapes. And in fact, in this particular case, in contrast to regular champagne, the grapes is allowed to stay in contact with, or the juice, I should say, is allowed to stay in contact with the skin. So it gives you a red champagne in contrast to regular champagne. You can find also a rosé type of champagne. And in this case, what happened is that the juice is allowed to stay in contact with the skin of the grape, but only for a short time to impart a small amount of color. Anyway, when it comes to this type of variety, it's real champagne, not what some people here call champagne. Now, what's so special about the champagne is, of course, the presence of the bubbles. And the rule is, the smaller the bubble, the longer lasting they are, the better the champagne. So what you want to see in a bottle of champagne, you want to see fine bubbles lasting a long period of time. Now, in sparkling carbonated water, it's the same as CO2, but in carbonated water, you get these very large bubbles. You'll notice on your tongue, and it's really not that pleasant. In beer, you get also CO2, and you get bubbles, but you get a lot of foam, so not the same as champagne. Now, there is an expression that is of interest. It's called sabrer le champagne. And the idea there is to open the champagne with a saber. If you go to fancy restaurants, sometime they will come and open the bottle with a saber. And apparently, this comes from the fact that when the Russian occupied the Champagne region after defeating Napoleon, they occupied all these caves, they hold these bottles of champagne, and they could not be bothered opening them one by one. So they would use their saber to actually open the champagne. And you can see on the left, you have a regular cork that was open, that was used in the opening and a champagne bottle the normal way. On the right-hand side, you can see that the cork actually still is attached to the neck of the bottle, indicating that it was opened with a saber. I would suggest that you be very careful when you try this particular method. Once I noticed a friend of mine was saying, well, I can open this with a saber. He took a large machete and tried to do that. The bottle exploded in his hand and he was covered with blood. So be very careful if you want to try this. By the way, there are a number of myths that have been put forward that if you want to keep the bubbles in the carbonation champagne, to put the silver spoon. Well, what this graph shows, you notice avec cuillère and sans cuillère, it really doesn't make any difference at all. This is not a particular way to save the carbonation. On the other hand, you notice in the red graph that if you use a capsule, you can keep some of the carbonation for a long period of time. And if you don't finish the bottle of champagne right away, which is difficult, you can always stop it, put a stopper, and keep it for the next day. You will keep a good deal of the carbonation. Now, just a little story here. Supposedly at the time of the Grande Époque, the time of the early 1900s, at the Maxim in the famous restaurant, if you had a girlfriend there, if you wanted to impress her, you would actually order a bottle of champagne, and you would ask for a shoe, and you would drink the champagne from her shoe. I don't know if I would try that, but this is actually the story. Now, when it comes to champagne bottle, you have got the quarter bottle, the half bottle, the regular bottle, and you have a Magnum, which is equivalent of 2 bottles. And you have also larger size. You have got the Jeroboam, which is 4 bottles. You have the Rehoboam, which is 6 bottles. You have the Methuselah, 8 bottles. You have the Salmanazar, 12 bottles. And then at top of the line, you have got the Nabucodonosor, which is equivalent to 20 bottles. Well, you need quite a lot of friends around the table if you want to go through 20 bottles of champagne at once. Actually, you need quite a few tables to be able to do that.